Recently, a former live-in boyfriend of Teal Swan's, Dobson, spoke out and told his story. It was a heartbreaking tale that he's been incredibly brave to share, and as a former Tealer watching it, it was difficult to watch, but it was also eye-opening. As I watched, a lot of stuff jumped out to me that I think will have jumped out to a lot of other former Tealers too. Some of it subtle, some of it more obvious, but most of it surrounding what seemed like ways in which Teal was getting what she wanted. Let's talk about that. I've included a link to the original video we'll be discussing in the description. In this video, I'll be joined by my friend and fellow former Tealer, Jess, to discuss Jared's story and highlight some of the more troubling things that Jared shared. You may recognize Jess. She's been on the channel before telling her story as a Tealer, an experience which led her into an abusive relationship. If you'd like to hear Jess's story after this video, there's a link to that in the description. But before we get started and jump into this, Jess, would you just like to tell our viewers a little bit about yourself?
Yeah, sure. So I have a history of counselling, but now I'm moving into teaching. So I'm still studying, and eventually I want to move on to be a lecturer. So my main focus is teaching English and psychology, because psychology is ultimately what my passion is. I've always been interested in that. And just based on my personal experience as well, I always wanted to make sense of the world and people around me. And this felt like a good way to go, just to educate people, because that's what we need right now. And
so you grew up Mormon as well, didn't you? Like so you've got some experience here. And the reason I bring Mormonism up is because Jared, who we'll be discussing in this video, grew up Mormon also. So that may come up here. So I suppose it's worth mentioning that now, that you might be able to speak to some of the points from that experience.
I was baptized when I was 8 years old in the Mormon church, and by the time I was like a teenager, maybe 13 or 14, I had minimal involvement in the church. That's when I started to get more into new agey stuff, came across Teal. But yeah, I definitely can relate to a lot of Jared's experiences and how he felt in the church.
So everything that we're sharing here is our opinion based on what we've seen in the Jared Dobson video by Mormon Stories podcast, and also what we're sharing is based on our own personal experiences. Neither of us are saying that we're an expert on any of the things we're discussing or anything like that. Really, what we're saying is based on our own opinions, and we would both encourage anybody watching this to do their own research and make up their own mind about the subject matter. I think that's always really important with things like this. If you agree, disagree, think we've missed something, or you'd like to share your point of view, please drop a comment below as we go through this. I'm always interested to hear what people have to say, but please be kind in the comment section if you are going to comment. First and foremost, before we get into this, I just want to say it is incredibly brave of Jared to come forward and to tell his story, and both Jess and I wish him well in his recovery. When people speak out in this way, it has an incredibly positive effect for former members who are still kind of making sense of everything and moving on after leaving Teal's teachings and everything like that behind. Trying to make sense of life after that. That said, we both understand that it can be an incredibly difficult thing for someone coming forward, telling their story in this way, and there's also typically a little bit of backlash as well. So I just wanted to say that, be sensitive to that and recognize Jared's bravery coming forward to tell his story on this. When a person comes forward like this, it's also like an affirmation for those who have looked at what Teal is doing and have felt like there was something wrong with it, whether they went into it and started to see through it, or whether, like it's sometimes the case, and I do see this in my comments a lot, when someone's kind of just watched 5 minutes of a Teal video and just gone, this isn't for me, I don't like this, I feel like something's wrong here, and then they click off. Whatever kind of a situation, whatever kind of an experience you've had, when someone steps forward in this way and tells their story in this way, it does make a huge difference for people who have, whether in a small way or a large way, been involved with it. So what we discussed, what Jared went through sounds a lot like manipulation on the part of Teal, directed towards Jared. And if what Jared is saying happened is the case, then there's a lot of different kinds of manipulation, I think. Some of it seems to pull out the rug from underneath him as to what he's expected to believe reality is, what he's expected to believe is possible. And then some of it sounds like textbook abusive relationship stuff, to me at least. And again, I'm no expert on this, but based on my experience and you know, what I think, that's what it seems like. But one last thing before we get started is that suicide and other related issues are going to be talked about here. So this is just your fair warning if that's difficult for you to hear, that is going to be the case. Just wanted to give you the heads up on that. Now, there's so much to discuss here. Like, we've been making notes as what we wanted to talk about, and there's so much to cover that we could start anywhere. But I think one of the best places to start, if not the best place to start, is on some of the wilder stuff. So let's just jump into this with Starseed alien stuff, which anyone who's a former New Ager will know it's when you get out of it and you look back, it's pretty wild, right? It's pretty strange stuff. So anyone who's not familiar with that, what it really is, the idea is that your sort of soul, if you like, is from another planet or something like that, right? Maybe, I imagine there's different versions of it, but the general idea is that your soul is from another planet and you've incarnated as a human to live out life on the earth for one reason or another, usually pertaining to what your origin, planet of origin is supposed to be known for, supposed to be good at, you know, that kind of a thing. So in terms of manipulation, what we're talking about here with the Starseed alien stuff is how it seems to have been used to create almost like cult identities here. And I'm gonna say cult identities because that's what I think's happening here. And it fits into something that I've wondered for a while about the Teal tribe situation, or the Teal situation, is that those of us who weren't living with her, it seemed like we were part of a cult, but we were like on the outer rings of a cult. And those who live with Teal, it seems, it's almost a cult within a cult. It's the inner circle. It's the tight knit ring within a cult. Based on what I've been able to pick up from different things that people who have come out of that and have spoken have said, and adding Jared to that now, it really does seem that that's the case. And in this case, we're talking about the idea of coming from another planet being used in some way to create an identity for the people close to Teal. In this instance, in Jared's case, he was told he was a reptilian alien, and anyone who knows anything about David Icke's whole Illuminati thing will know they're the bad ones, right? It struck me as manipulative when I saw it. I want to be clear here, none of the things we're going through are attempts to make it look like manipulation is happening. This is just our opinions based on what we're seeing, and there is mentions of manipulation throughout it.
Yeah.
But how did this hit you when you heard about this?
When I heard about it, it really seemed like if you were talking about something spiritual like that, something otherworldly, then it's not something that can be physically proven. So it's like unfalsifiable. You can't prove that it didn't happen because it's on some other plane. And I think that alone, like that in itself is part of, if there's manipulation happening, that would be part of it, because it just goes alongside Teal saying that she has these powers, so she has access to all this information, and this is just part of that. Jared can't say that it didn't happen necessarily because it's existing on a plane that he doesn't necessarily have access to. I think it really helped to increase his shame, because him as reptilians are pretty much considered bad. Like they're like the bad guys, they're the villains, and he was someone who broke away, and she could use that to say that he had done horrible things. And another way of being able to manipulate him with this is to say that certain things that he could have potentially done but not remembered when he was younger that were evil or just generally considered bad, that could be backed up with, well, you don't remember because that was your reptilian self, and that could be all sorts of ways.
and to almost repurpose events in his life in order to use them to prop up this idea that he is this, and explain the things he does as though there's a part of him he can't trust. Perhaps it's like you were saying about your reptilian self. I'm not sure if he mentioned that in there, I missed it. But if that's that kind of using that hidden part of a person, if that's what was happening, then yeah, that troubles me, I think, as well. If you look at Robert J. Lifton's work on thought, his book Thought Reform and the Psychology of Totalism, he talks about mystical manipulation. It's something I've talked about a fair bit on the channel. In fact, it's probably out of his 8 criteria for thought reform, is probably the thing I talk about most, because it's so prevalent, I think, in the new age. The idea of an individual, a guru, a leader, a cult leader, whatever it is, and all of the above and more, claiming to have some kind of knowledge of something, claiming to see something others don't, claiming to be privy to some knowledge that others don't have access to, and then using that to get people to do things the way that they think is right, on the promise that things will be better, or that they will instate some new better norm as a consequence of that. But like you say, at no point proving it, and make it and constructing a story in such a way that you don't have to, because the claims you're making are so out there. Why would you? And obviously that's part of it. I think there's more to it than why would you lie. But yeah, like that, the mystical manipulation thing definitely applies here, I think, in the idea of seeing certain things that no one else is seeing, and then using those things to encourage an individual to do things in a certain way, without ever providing any evidence that is the right way to do things, or that what you're saying in the first place is anywhere close to true.
I just want to quickly mention as well that I didn't hear, well, from memory, I can't remember him saying that she used that to say that that's why he did certain bad things. But I'm just speculating that because she's considered like the whole reptilian thing to be they're the bad guys, and she has also said that he's done bad things. Obviously, those are memories that she pulled out of him. It's like a similar method. So it's something that he can't remember, that she's helped him to remember both of those situations anyway. So I think that they could tie in. There's a possibility that someone can use something like that to say that you've done things that you don't remember.
Yeah, of course. And of course, we don't know whether that happened or not. But if that is the case, then that is likely to be likely to cause someone to do something that they don't necessarily know whether it is a good idea, whether they want to do it, but the person wants them to do. And we'll come back to the false memory thing and the idea of getting someone to believe certain things are true through the use of false memories. I'm sure we'll come back to that. I'm not sure if it was in our notes for this episode or not. But while I say that, there's so much that we want to talk about here that we're planning on doing several episodes here. So if you want to see more of this, then subscribe to the channel. I'll pop it into a playlist as we put each new episode out. You'll be able to see that. This first episode, we're talking about manipulation. We'll be tackling this from a few different angles in the episodes as we go on. So another thing that we've made a note of here is the threats of suicide as a way to manipulate. Which I know you wanted to talk about a little bit, because there's a lot of stigma around BPD with regards to that, and that was mentioned in the original video. Yeah, for sure. Here.
So I know a fair bit about BPD, and it's something that there definitely is a lot of stigma around. Psychologists typically will decline seeing you if you have BPD. Not all of them, but because of the myths that surround it, they will say you just can't work with them. There's nothing you can do for them. And it's often because they're seen as manipulative, like they might manipulate the therapist. But once again, I believe that this is very, and based on research anyway, if you just look into the research behind BPD, it's very misguided to think that. So if it's true that Teal does have BPD, I do want to lend some sympathy to her. And I'm not in any way trying to diagnose her, but just if it is true, then it's possible that these suicide attempts are showing that she really is in deep pain. These threats of suicide, the self-harming in BPD, that comes from a place of deep, deep pain that many others can't relate to because it's just off the charts. That's and it's not something that is easily controlled either. But I personally think that, and I am in no way, like I said, diagnosing or anything like that, just based on my research on personality disorders, I can see that if her manipulation was intentional, then it would seem like that would be a more calculating thing that is not stereotypical in BPD behavior, and would probably be something more similar to narcissism, like narcissistic personality disorder or antisocial personality disorder.
You know, I, unlike you, have no education on any of this kind of thing. But when you hear something like that, it does stick out to me as like there's more to this. What's going on here? And you know, suicide is such a heavy, difficult subject to talk about, and I think it's important to be gentle on that point, because it's not something that I would want to be any part of encouraging people to assume. It may be the case, as you say, but it equally could not be, and I wouldn't want to encourage people to assume that of someone with BPD or of Teal, whether or not she has it. And as you say, we have no idea whether she has it or not, so it's important, and I'm glad we talk about that a little bit.
In BPD, there is this fear of abandonment. So I mean, some of the things that Jared talks about with Teal, it does seem that she had that fear of being abandoned. But like I said, if those attempts or gestures or threats were intentional, as mentioned before, that could have a tie to narcissism, and it's not actually uncommon. I think it's important to mention that it's not uncommon for there to be for those things to be comorbid, so BPD and narcissism. Not to say that everyone with BPD definitely has narcissistic personality disorder or other way around, but they can occur together. And if that's the case, it's a lot more complicated.
Yeah, of course. And as well, it's difficult to sit here and have a conversation about whether someone has a disorder when you aren't sitting in front of them and know everything you need to know. Like in my case, I don't sit here and say anything other than maybe. I don't know. And I think I see this a lot, and this is another important point on this. I do see this a lot around Teal, is that people are very quick to say she's got this, she's got that. And I know people who have been like in personal contact with her, as in lived with her and stuff, have come out and said she has diagnoses, this and that, and maybe she does. Again, I wouldn't want to take all of that on face value or just on just to say so of someone, which is why, as we're going through this today, it's really important for me personally to say that all of what we're talking about here is if what Jared is saying is the case. And that's not to say I don't believe Jared. It's just to say that this is such a situation where so much is coming out, so many people are saying so many different things, that really I only start to believe things when I see multiple people who don't seem to be in touch with each other are reporting the same thing, or I've seen it with my own eyes. I start to believe it a little bit more then, so not to say we're not believing anything that Jared's saying, but yeah, I think the thing I wanted to talk about here as well, while we're on the idea of like disorders and speaking about this in terms of psychology a little bit more, there's a book that I listened to relatively recently called The Adult Children of Emotionally Immature Parents, which is a somewhat incendiary title, and I realized that, by Lindsay C. Gibson. But in that book, Gibson talks about these urgent emotional dramas being a hallmark of emotionally immature people. And I don't want to use the term emotionally immature as an insult. I'm not intending that in any way. Purely, I'm using that term descriptively, in the sense of like someone who has, let's say, lower than average levels of emotional intelligence would perhaps be a way to say it. Someone who doesn't have necessarily the emotional skills to communicate or whatever, or they're struggling with something or other. And I don't want to get into drawing lines between what someone hasn't got, disorders, this and that. But speaking in terms of what Gibson has said in this book, the idea of an urgent emotional drama stood out to me. And I was listening to the book, and it reminded me of what I have heard from people who have been in contact with Teal. And as I was listening to this this interview with Jared, it stuck out to me there. The way he's talking about, and we'll come back to this a little bit, it's all trauma and drama, or in his accent, it's trauma and drama, right? But trauma and drama doesn't have the same ring with a British accent. But he's talking about how there's always something going on, and there's these kinds of emotional moments where everyone's sort of gathered round and everyone has to make sure Teal's okay and all that kind of thing. That for me sounds very similar to that. So I would recommend that book for anyone who's interested in it. As far as I know, it's all good, backed up and everything. If it's not, please feel free to let me know if I'm getting some bad information there. But yeah, it does kind of strike me as relevant there, in my opinion. And this is all I want to say is, if you're struggling with that kind of thing, then giving advice which doesn't necessarily correspond with what evidence-based information in terms of how to deal with emotions and so on and so forth may not be the right thing to do, in my opinion. Now, I don't know everything about the right way to deal with emotions based on psychology, but from what I've seen in Teal's videos and so on, based on what I know, it doesn't always line up with the facts in terms of the better way to deal with things. Sometimes it does, I'm sure, and sometimes what she's saying does work. But if you're someone who is dealing with all this stuff, for example, urgent emotional dramas, and then you're giving advice which doesn't stack up and fit together with what we are showing based on evidence is effective in dealing with emotions, then there's a disconnect there. I would say learn to deal with your own emotions first, if you can. And then if you think that you've got a way that bucks the trend a little bit that's better, then we can look at that after the fact. I know that there's like a point where it's like, well, you can know something's the case, even if you aren't able to apply it for yourself. But how do you know it's the case if it's disagreeing with what we have established is true, or what we've established is effective in terms of treating emotions and so on and so forth? So yeah, I know that was like a really long little rant there, but I think I got the point I wanted to get to in the end. But yeah, is there anything you would add to that? Feel free to disagree if you think I got anything wrong there. On that.
Yeah, no, I think that's pretty much, I can agree with that. Something I wanted to add, though, was about manipulation. And to make sure that when we're talking about manipulation, that it's, well, at least from my perspective, I've noticed that people, and in no way do I think you were doing that, but some people can, when they're talking about someone being manipulative, it becomes like their identity, and it becomes a reason to see that person as all bad. And I want to be sure that we're not doing that.
No,
that
we're
not saying that if manipulation is involved, that Teal is a manipulator, and that's her whole, like, that's who she is as an identity, like her personality. Because the truth is, everyone manipulates sometimes, and it's an inborn part of just who we are as people. I mean, you see babies when they can't get what they want from their parents. It's just so natural to them to try to find some way of getting, because if they can't communicate it with words, there's always something that they're learning that they can do. If I cry enough, if I make a big enough deal, like emotionally, then my parents are going to come back and comfort me. So we learn from a very young age to do that. As we get older, we learn to find healthier ways of coping.
Right, exactly.
And we're just recognizing in this video that the ways that Teal may be dealing with things, based on what Jared said, may not be healthy and may still be quite underdeveloped.
I'd agree with that, yeah. And I think one of the things I always come back to with, in terms of like emotional maturity, emotional intelligence and things like that, is that if you as a person weren't provided with lessons on how to develop emotional tools to deal with these kinds of things in your life, then how can you be expected to have those tools later if at no point you have been given them or taught them or found them in some way? And some people don't. Some people go their whole lives without ever really finding a healthy way to deal with their emotions in general. Some emotions, we all deal with, like you say, we all develop ways to do these things. And if we're not in an environment where we're able to be taught those, we're able to pick them up from other people, then it's understandable, I think, that there's a point where we might develop these unhealthy ways of going about trying to get what we want, which is ultimately, as far as I can see it, what we're really talking about here, the ways in which Teal, in this case, according to what Jared has said, is going about getting what she wants or what she feels she needs in a given situation. You know, we're all going to find different ways of doing that, and what we're looking at here, it seems, is the ways that Teal is doing that. And as you say, seem to be in some way perhaps underdeveloped, based on what Jared's saying. So I think it's really important, and I know, and I suppose we should just be really clear about this as well as we're talking about this. The instinct, as someone who supports Teal, follows Teal, believes in Teal, believes what Teal's saying, when you hear someone disagreeing with her, when you hear someone criticizing her or saying something even which is contrary to something that she has asserted as true, the instinct, and I know this because I was there at one point, the instinct is to jump on the person saying it and explain what they're saying away with something other than, maybe they're saying this because they believe it's true, maybe they're saying this because it is true, or something along those lines. It's very easy to say they're saying it because they hate you, or they're saying it because they're jealous, something like that. You know, all sorts of things I've heard since I've started to talk about Teal a little bit on the channel. And so anyone who is a Tealer who is watching this, just encourage you, please just perhaps set that desire to explain things in that way aside for a little while and be open to what we're saying here.
Yeah,
So
make your own mind up, basically.
absolutely,
If
the most important thing is that,
it would definitely encourage critical thinking and skepticism, and that's not just one-sided. It's not just be skeptical of Teal, it's be skeptical of us too. Like, if you don't believe something that we've said is accurate, we want to know, and we want you to find the truth as best as you can.
So, you know, and as I said at the beginning, if you feel there's anything that we're saying here that is inaccurate, please feel free to comment, let us know. I'd be, you know, if anything I find that we've said is factually incorrect and I've been able to verify that it's factually incorrect, I'm happy to issue a correction, as I've done in the past. You know, absolutely fine with that. So speaking here, there's something that you noted down here, with regards to intermittent abuse, and trauma bonding, which I have no real knowledge on. I've heard the terms. I don't have any real formal knowledge on that. But so what are you thinking with that regarding what Jared said in his story here?
Really stood out to me that there was this reward punishment system happening, and so that's like intermittent abuse, where it's not like the whole time he's being abused by Teal, based on, and like I said, all of this is based on what he said, so I'm not claiming for sure that she did all of these things, but I'm just assuming it's true. Based on that, then it seems like it was intermittent, so it was ongoing, but there was breaks in between, and in those breaks he described it as being like blissful, like a blissful experience. So the times where he was not being manipulated, where he there was like you can almost see it like an ocean, and like, as humans, obviously if we're beneath the surface, then after a while we're going to feel like we're drowning, basically. So we're in pain. That would be the manipulation, wouldn't it? So that would be like eventually you're going to have to come up for air. And those good parts of the relationship were like the big breaths of fresh air after he had been submerged in all of this overwhelming just stories about his being a reptilian, stories like false memories, things like that coming up, being made to feel like he was somehow a bad person, being made to feel ashamed of himself, and like if he wasn't doing exactly what Teal wanted, then something was wrong and he had to correct that behavior. Yeah, that's very common in abusive relationships. It's something that actually bonds you to the abuser more, because when you do, it's like more intense when you do get the reward. If you're beneath the surface of the ocean long enough, you've been holding your breath long enough, when you do get that fresh air, it's going to feel way better. It's going to be like more of a jolt to your system of, wow, this is amazing. I really appreciate oxygen more than I did before, like, because I've been down there. I've been so low beneath the surface that I can see that contrast. So that it's a binding thing. It's kind of like an addiction. That's why it makes it very difficult for people who are being abused to leave their abuser, because of the blissful times, because of the intense reward and that feeling of fresh air, that just metaphorically speaking.
So like a slot machine, like you're there and you're pulling the lever, and the times that you don't get the reward, the times that you don't get the money, you're like, oh, and then suddenly you get loads of big prize comes in and it feels great, and you just think, I want that again.
Yeah.
And but the bad times outweigh the good times, and the bad times are such that they aren't the kind of bad times that you would just work through in a healthy relationship, I suppose,
Yeah.
So in terms of trauma bonding, can you explain that a little bit more?
Mostly that's what it is. It's just like, it is that you're going through enough punishment and reward, and that alternates. It's just ongoing. It usually begins in a relationship that the person love bombs you. They make you feel really special. They lure you in somehow with their charm. Or obviously you wouldn't be with that person if they were straight up just being rude to you and putting you down. So they lure you in that way. And then gradually, it just gradually gets deeper and deeper, worse and worse. You start to see these other characteristics coming up that by the time you see them, you're already hooked on that person, because they were everything you wanted them to be. And they have a way of making you feel that you're special. Whatever you like, they will match that, like a chameleon. But then it really just flips. It becomes, eventually, there's more abuse than there is the rewarding, blissful times. But you're still in the relationship. You're still there because you're addicted to that feeling that you initially got, and those brief moments of reward that they will still give you, that remind you, okay, they're still capable of doing that. There's still a chance. And the person...
So you hang in for the good times, hoping that you can get that back, or that you can figure out a way to. And I suppose there's also that thing, and just before we carry on, a lot of what you're talking about here was what makes me think how important it is to talk about cults in this regard as well, because a lot of Stephen Hassan talks about how abusive relationships can be cults. I know Chris Shelton has said that, and I spoke about this in the video I did on domestic abuse a little bit, how cults really are just an abusive relationship that's been rolled out to more people, right? And that's a quote I included from Chris Shelton at the beginning of that video, and it really does seem to be true. And a lot of what you're talking about here does fit in to, when you look at the bite model, for example, Hassan's bite model, you see that.
I think there have been experiments on rats as well of something similar, like the rewards and punishments, but it's not very fresh in my memory, so I'm not gonna...
I think part of this as well is that you end up feeling like you're the one that has to do the thing that's going to make it better eventually. Like, it comes down to you as the person who is being abused in that kind of a situation. If you're the cult member rather than the cult leader, you're the one that ends up feeling like it's down to you to fix the thing, and the leader tells you how, right? Whether they do that overtly or whether it's through a system of rewards and punishments, it seems that that's what happens in one way or another. That you and you see it in all sorts of ideologies as well that maybe don't encroach quite into cult terrain, like a lot of the self-help stuff as well, the ideas of success, and if you're not successful yet, you're not doing it right, the law of attraction, blaming the victim, it all fits into that as well. And then
shadow work,
you hit well, exactly, with the whole shadow work thing with Teal Tribe, and then, of course, MLMs, you hear it as well. You do hear it a lot in MLMs, which also encroach on cult territory quite quickly too. So you mentioned love bombing there as well, which does come up a lot in cults and stuff as well. And I think with Jared, we do hear a lot about that, what he's saying here.
Yeah. I mean, being told that they were always meant to be, and it's just this magical,
Right.
yeah,
Yeah.
like
Yeah.
this very
Yeah.
magical, like fate-driven thing, that there's something beyond them that is moving them towards each other.
Mm.
So it's not just grounded in reality kind of love bombing. It's taking the mystical, intertwining that in there, and making it even more powerful. So it
Yeah.
just
And that
shows.
also, sorry, go on. I was going, go on.
No, that's fine. It just shows that with manipulation, it's not just one thing isolated from another, one tactic used sometimes over here, and then they're
Mm.
separate. It's like they all merge together and
Mm.
create a web of manipulation.
Right. And that fits into mystical manipulation as well. Again, it's like seeing something, claiming to have seen something that is true, that only you somehow have access to. And yeah, and then you kind of use that to get things to be how you want them to be, get people to think in the way that you want them to think, act in the way you want to act. It's that same kind of thing again, according to what Jared said, Teal saying that she has that she believes that they were always meant to be, and then repurposing stories from periods in his life to fit into a story of how she was, for example, at one place, I can't remember the location that he said in the video, but that she was apparently there and he wasn't there for her when she needed him. So adding on the guilt there as well in that, and then saying, I'm not going to mess it up this time, like creating like almost like a strange fantasy romance story
Yeah.
around this, and making, and I think what's really interesting about this, and I don't know whether there's anything in sort of psychological regard in this on this, but the idea of it seeming like the rules are changed when you create something that's such a fantasy, such a against all odds. This thing that we've created here is so unlikely, so not of this world, that it's almost like the rules don't apply anymore. Like,
Mm.
so then it's in my mind, it opens a door to this kind of abuse that could well have been happening here,
Yeah.
where where you can get away with doing things that you wouldn't otherwise have been able to get with, because there are these rules. And I suppose it fits into a little bit what we talked about when you told your story to do with the twin flame thing. Like, you start to
Yeah.
explain things in a different way, right? Because
Yeah.
you're just going through this filter of we're meant to be, and this is not bad, this is us growing together, or this is us learning to whatever the story is. And I
Yeah.
imagine it's different for each couple, but yeah.
The narrative is totally different, and
Mm.
it's almost like being in a constant hypnotic state. You're just like you're in
Mm.
a dream or something. The dream starts to feel like reality, and then reality, when that actually kicks in, that you're convinced that that's not the real person, that
Mm.
those sides of them that they're showing that are just completely awful. That's not what's real, because what's real is that we're meant to be, and if we're meant to be, then this is something that we've got to work through. This can't be true. So it's like
Mm.
denying reality, which I think is really dangerous.
Yeah.
Yeah, and it's just I couldn't move on from the love bombing thing without mentioning his tattoo that says "I will find a way," and I think that really ties
Yeah.
in as well,
Yeah.
because it's like it was like a mantra that he had to say to her, and
Mm.
that came into it a lot too. Just the reassurance seeking from Teal, of him having to say, "Oh, I'll find a way. I'll make it better. I'll save
Which
you."
she said that he would say to her in her dreams, if I
Yeah.
remember,
Mm.
like he would talk to her, and she would say, "In my dreams, you always tell me that you'll find a way."
Yeah.
And so that became, whether it happened in her dreams or not, we would have to take her word for.
Yeah.
Um, but if it did, so she's now turning what's happened in her dream into what he's supposed to say, almost like to encourage him to feel like he has to do this at any cost. And that also ties into something else that he mentioned. I think I remember Jared was talking about Teal saying this to Blake. I think
Mm.
we have to be willing to die for this cause.
Yeah.
And I mean, that struck me, looking at that through the lens of cults, that I
Mm.
was like, okay, right, that was worrying for me, because I'm thinking that kind of thinking on the surface, in moment to moment, you could think, well, that's just someone who's being a little bit melodramatic, saying that they need to care about this. But then you also think, look at the rest of the situation here. Look at the other things that are happening. Look at the similarities and how it fits things like the bite model and Lifton's criteria. It's troubling to me. And I know everybody always talks about Jim Jones and Jonestown and things when they talk about cults. And I do tend to avoid talking about that, because that's the thing everyone thinks of. And there's more to cults than that specific example, even though it is obviously just one of the worst examples that we've ever had. When you hear of Teal having apparently said something like that, it's like, okay, right, some situations that could escalate, and I would worry that it would down the line. That for me is always a concern with something like this. And just sort of coming back to what we mentioned earlier, the trauma and drama thing, right? The trauma and drama thing. I have to think about how I pronounce that now when I've said it that way. We may have mentioned that before, and Jared also has talked about how when something happens, like at an event or something in the video, he's talking about how Teal, if she gets upset, she'll take herself away to a room, and there's like a whole drama around it. And saying, according to Jared, and I think I'm paraphrasing when I said this. I wrote a note down here of what I think he said, but it's an approximation, something like, Teal saying something like, we've got to do something about this person. We need to find a way to control them. I don't know if that's something Teal said, or if that's what he feels Teal meant by what she said, or whatever. Try and be as fair as possible there. But that, for me, that's interesting. As someone who went to a workshop, who sat in the audience, who called out and singled myself out, not going on stage or anything, but anyone who hasn't heard the story before, basically what happened was I was at the London workshop in 2014. Teal came out onto the stage. She kind of just like asked everyone how they were. There was kind of a mumble. Everyone was like, oh, yeah, we're good, thanks, and that. And then I just kind of shouted out and went, how are you? Which you don't do at an event like that. It's definitely singled myself out, but channeling that belligerent college kid that used to do exactly that when I was at college. And she just kind of went, I'm okay. But after that, Blake came up to me and talked to me. And then not the next day, but the day after, I ended up spending the day with Blake and Graciela and a number of other Tealers. And it makes me wonder. I've often tried to put that experience into perspective. It's the one time I ever really had any one-to-one contact with Teal in the whole thing. And yet she had quite an impact on me as someone who would watch her videos a lot, who had pretty much absorbed everything she had put out there, in terms of what to think and how to think, with her teachings and stuff. That being the one-to-one contact I ever really had. I've tried to put that into context a lot, and it strikes me as odd that Blake said something to me when we were hanging out. And by the way, for anyone who's not familiar, Blake and Graciela are two long-serving members of what we could perhaps call Teal's Inner Circle. These are two of the closest people to Teal. Blake's been there since the very beginning and before, as far as I know. Graciela came along a little bit later, but is Teal's closest friend, I believe. And so, having spent that day with them, and I remember when we were hanging out, Blake said something to me, like he'd said that the reason he wanted to hang out with me because he thought I just got to meet this Andy guy or something like that. And obviously now I'm not using guy, we would say this Andy person, but I'm not going to edit the past. That's, I think, pretty much what he said. And so it makes me wonder, listening to what Jared said about all of this, he's talking about how when something would happen, Teal would have this kind of a thing. She'd be upset, and then there'd be, we got to do something about this person. We've got to bring them in line in some way. Perhaps I singled myself out. Perhaps them meeting up with me and sussing me out, perhaps that day, was that kind of thing. I've always been a bit like a puppy dog when I'm excited, and so I feel like I wouldn't necessarily have fit in with the whole trauma and drama thing as someone there. So me singling myself out as someone who was willing to just be a little bit silly, I think, in that kind of a situation, meant that I drew attention to myself, and perhaps that was all it was. I don't know. But it stood out to me that, and I think the trauma and drama thing as well also fits into what we were saying before about these urgent emotional dramas as well. This thing is like something happens and suddenly now everyone needs to deal with what this person's going through. And I don't think that's unique to Teal, you know. I've seen it as well in other cases in my life. Everyone around needs to now focus on this person and what this person thinks is happening. And they're really upset. And now everyone feels like they need to look after this person and take care of this person, keep them safe. Which again, don't know if this is in this this list or the other list, but that reminds me as well of the dreams that Tealers apparently have. When I was a Tealer, I dreamt about Teal. Did you have dreams as well, Jess, or not when you were a Tealer?
I feel like I had one very briefly, but I don't really remember it, and I don't think it was that significant. It was like I just saw her very briefly, but I remember other people having dreams and like posting on her timeline and being like, "Oh, Teal, you were in my dream. Thank you. You told me this," and she would respond. What troubled me was that she would respond as if she really was there. And it's not like, "Oh, you had a dream about me. That's nice." Like, I didn't have anything to do with that. No, it was like a wink or like, "Yeah, I was in your dream," because like that was
like it was actually her, and what was said.
I was out of body and I went there. And,
Yeah. Which is of course concerning when you, for example, got someone who it may be the case who's struggling with some kind of mental health issue, and they think Teal's told them to do something, for example, in a dream, and she's reinforcing the idea that it's actually her. That strikes me as concerning. That can go in a pretty troubling direction pretty quickly there. So I would say that's if that's happening, then that's irresponsible as far as I'm concerned. I also heard, and I can put an image up on the screen here just now as I'm saying this, in relation to nightmares as well. Apparently some people have had nightmares, and according to Teal, you can see on the screen here, she talks about how people are having nightmares about her because she's a symbolic representation of authority for people, and their dreams about her are really about whatever their relationship to authority is, ergo not to do with her. Like it's like it, and that strikes me as interesting, because if it is actually her in the dream, which you do see sometimes, and she has spoken, as far as I'm aware as well, and like you just said there, as if it is her in the dream, this is a different message that we're getting now, which is actually that it's not her in the dream, that actually it's just a version of her that they're experiencing, which is more to do with their relationship with authority than actually who she is. So it's almost like, well, that's not actually me now. But what you also, and you mentioned this here as well, which we could perhaps come back to, about a power imbalance, about how, and you see it, and this sort of ties into the dreams thing. As I said, I'll just make a quick mention of this and then let you talk a little bit. But there's this thing, and I had it, and I've heard other people have had it as well, and where people feel like they look up to Teal, they idolize Teal, but they also want to save Teal, right? And again, I've got another example of this, which I can put up on the screen now, which was a post that I was sent by someone. We've pixelated the names and everything to keep identities private, but this kind of strikes me as weird. Post-apocalyptic anime fantasy thing, where a Tealer has written what they feel is a little joke. I suppose it's a little joke, but it's a little bit telling as well, I think, from my point of view, about how people see Teal as someone who needs to be saved. So they, and as I say, from my experience, this is the case as well. I looked up to Teal. I adored her. I idolized her in a way, but at the same time, I felt like I needed to protect her. I needed to keep her safe, which fits into what Jared's saying here about this something going wrong and everyone's swarming and protecting Teal, looking after Teal. Things you hear about Teal, apparently, I haven't got reference for this, so I'm just going on memory, but Teal apparently saying that she wasn't able to plug things into like power outlets in the wall for one reason or another, and all these kinds of things, that because it triggered her or something like that. I remember from way back when. And if that's wrong, if anyone has any, if you think that's wrong or whatever, then please feel free to set me right on that. But That's just going on memory there. All fits into this kind of story of someone who is very wise, very knowledgeable, very powerful, and can tell you the truth and set you right, but also someone who needs to be protected, someone who's special and sacred and fragile and precious in some way. And that you mentioned here about power imbalance,
Yeah.
and yeah, the idea of her being a victim, but also in there perhaps being some power in positioning oneself as a victim.
Yeah. The strange thing is that when she's positioning herself as a victim, she's kind of like giving power in a sense. It appears on the surface that she's doing that, but it's really working the other way around. So it's like she's giving power to the illusion of power to Jared in the situations that he was talking about. But by creating scenarios where she has to be saved, it's really just keeping him around, like making him feel that he can't go anywhere because she needs him. Then at the same time, that will flip and it will be like, well, you need me because I have this insight and this knowledge that you can't get anywhere else.
Right.
Because
yeah.
I have a direct connection to source energy and the Akashic records and things like that. She would just there are things that she knows that he doesn't. She knows things about his past lives. She knows things about his own life now that he doesn't remember. Things like, once again, going back to false memories, which she would call recovered memories or something like that. So yeah, either way, it's like on the surface it might look like in some situations he's got the power, but really she's pulling the strings. She's giving him that, and by giving him that, she still really has it. Does that make sense? Because she's dictating how it goes.
Yeah, I get you. And of course, again, this is all if what Jared is saying is true. We're just going on what he said here. Just want to be super clear about that time and time again, so that no one's getting the wrong end of the stick here. This dynamic as well, you see it rolled out over the whole cult. You see this, and again, I'm calling it a cult because I believe it to be a cult, but please make up your own mind. I'm not using that to attack. I'm using that as a descriptive term. And you will notice if you watch any of my videos, I do that a lot. It sounds like I'm using a word, maybe a word that others might use to attack, but typically I'm using it as a descriptive term. I'm learning that that's not the case for everyone. I'm learning that quite recently. So when I'm using the word cult, I'm not throwing that around as an insult. I'm using that because I believe that to be the case based on what I believe happens within Teal Tribe that fulfills Stephen Hassan's bite model, which there's a link to a breakdown of in the description. So looking at what you've said there, what you've described there, I think that does roll out over the whole cult as well. This kind of being a victim, but also being in some way in control. What's really interesting about cults in general is that you often find that the members do model the leader. They become like the leader in some way. And I know from my experience, that was the case. I adopted a lot of her mannerisms. I mean, you can see I've done videos where I'm looking back at old videos from the time and sort of laughing at them really at where I was, not anyone else who's in that state, but like at myself for some of the things I used to say and do. And yeah, I was fully modeling Teal. I'd become her in a way in my mind without ever really putting my finger on that until later. And that does happen a lot. If the leader, in this case Teal, is the ideal and is positioning themselves as such, then the followers will aspire to be like them, which is very normal. I think very, very normal in even non-cult situations. But when you have someone who is perhaps not someone who's well suited to a leadership position, someone who believes themselves to have all the answers and isn't presenting evidence as to why those answers are true and things like that, then it can start to get troubling, I think, with this kind of a situation. And we see that there. You've made a note here about repetitive mantras, which we've talked about a little bit here with the tattoo and the idea of him getting back to her. Was there anything else that you wanted to speak about there?
I mean, when you tie that in with everything else, it's quite stereotypical of brainwashing. If you repeat something enough, then it really helps to store it in your long-term memory. It becomes embedded in your mind. And I don't know the details of how that went. It was when Jared was talking, nothing against him at all, because when you're talking about something that is very personal and traumatic to you, it's emotional, it's hard to talk in a way that is like well presented, I guess you could say. It is
Right,
I felt that he was kind of all over the place, and that, like I said, is not an insult. It's just that when he did mention those things, they seemed a bit random. Like I don't have much context surrounding it, but I can say that if he described it as repetitive, I would see that as a problem.
Yeah, and it could even fall under thought stopping, perhaps, if it is what it seems like it might be here. To think of things in a certain way, to encourage someone to think of things in a certain way, so that ultimately they do things in a certain way.
I also want to mention too that like she could have a defense mechanism, and I'm only speculating that because it is typical in BPD, but it's not limited to BPD, called splitting. Now, everyone does this to a degree, but it seems more common in people with BPD. It's where you idealize somebody, and then when you're in that state of idealizing them, they're all good, that they can't do any wrong. And then as soon as they do something that is unfavorable, instead of just seeing that this person is more in the gray zone, they're like, they have some good qualities and they have some bad qualities. They make mistakes, right? But they're just human. Instead, with splitting, there is no in between. They're now devalued and they're perceived as all bad. And then it might be that when you're in that state of devaluation, that person, anything they do could be perceived as an attempt to do wrong to you. Like they're only being good to me right now because they're trying to get something from me. Or so I feel that from what Jared's explained, there could be some of that involved. And once again, I'm just speculating. But also I think that can actually encourage the person who's being idealized and devalued to then do that to the person who's done it to them. It can become something that's shared, because it's possible that I can't speak for him, but it's possible that Jared alternates between seeing Teal as all good still, and then like she can't do any wrong, she's amazing, and then jumping to devaluing her. And the trouble with that is that there is truth in both of those things, but it's just not an integrated sense of seeing that person as a whole. That can be a problem.
Yeah.
But abuse sets people up to have that coping mechanism. So trauma, people being inconsistent, which you see a lot of from what Jared explained, a lot of inconsistency, giving him so much bliss, and then just these horrendous moments, like horrible memories that he has.
Speaking of memories, let's talk about the elephant in the room. Whenever we have a conversation about Teal, recovered and false memories come up at some point. And so let's talk about that a little bit, because Jared mentioned in his experience, in the story that he told of his experiences on the Mormon Stories podcast, about essentially being led through the recovering of what he seems to be speaking about as false memories now, in hindsight. Being told to lay down, being told to effectively, as far as I understand it, visualize and imagine what might have happened. And as the host, who I'm blanking on the name of, sorry about that, if you're watching,
I've forgotten as well.
So he was talking about how perhaps because of the setting, that it's intended in some way to recover memories. He's already primed to think of things in those terms, that when he's laying down, and what he may be imagining, he may just be making things up. And like the host said, like an author does when they're writing a story, and he's laying down, but he's being told they're going to be memories, not things he's imagining, not fictions, right? And so he's coming out of it perhaps feeling like what he's recovered are memories. And for anyone who's not familiar with false memories, there's a great book called The Memory Illusion by Dr. Julia Shaw, which I highly recommend. You can get it on Amazon. I listen to it on Audible, so there is that. Maybe I shouldn't be plugging Amazon at the moment. Jeff Bezos isn't everyone's favorite right now, but yeah, it's a very good book. Highly recommend it. And in that, Dr. Shaw talks about how false memories really are quite easy to implant. In fact, every time we're remembering something, we're more likely remembering the last time we remembered that thing than we are remembering the original thing. So every time we recall something, the memory changes a little bit. So we think of our minds. I think is this the right name? Kathleen Taylor in Brainwashing talks about, we think of ourselves, our minds as like diamond minds, and that they don't change ever. But actually that's not the case. And I think it's comforting to think of ourselves in those terms. Like it's a nice idea to think I'm not going to be affected by any of this. And I often see like I'm never going to be indoctrinated, I'm never going to be brainwashed because I know this and that. And you just think, actually that might be setting you up to be more voice went then, that might actually be setting you up to be more easily manipulated, or at least to fall into the trap, because you're confident and then you're not going to question what's happening perhaps. So I think in terms of memory, in terms of what we think of ourselves as, if we think of ourselves as these diamond minds, these people that are never going to be affected by things, and that our sense of self, our concept of who we are, and as part of that, the memories that make up a lot of who we think we are and what we think the world is and who we think people are and so on, that being as malleable as it is, that being as easily alterable, if that's even a word, as it is, really does lend to the possibility that in a situation like what Jared's describing, if this is indeed what happened, the recovery of false memories is absolutely a possibility. Absolutely. And again, I'll give you my sources: Kathleen Taylor's Brainwashing and Dr. Julia Shaw's The Memory Illusion on that. I do think that those are worth a read on memory and on brainwashing in general, on thought reform, to use Lifton's term. Yeah, it stands out to me. Obviously, Teal's history with regards to Barbara Snow and the Satanic Panic and all of those things as well, in my mind, don't lend to the credibility of Teal's position. They don't do her any favors in that regard. But is there anything you would add to that? Anything you'd like to say with regards to false memories and Jared's story?
Yeah, definitely. Two things. First of all, if anyone is a bit confused about false memories and just memory in general, and you're curious and you just want to know how memory works, Netflix actually has a series called The Mind Explained, and one of those episodes is on memory. It's really good. It shows the connection between imagination, the part of our brain that imagines things, visualizes, and memory. So that would be worth watching if you just want to educate yourself a little bit more, but just want to relax and you're not really wanting to read all these studies or something.
It's like a light version.
A light version, yeah. But
nice.
it should be enough to help you get some idea that it might be a little bit risky when you're trying to recover memories, because you don't necessarily...
Especially if you're not dealing with a trained and qualified professional. You are doing anything to do with memory that you are with a trained, qualified, experienced professional, I would say specialized, hopefully, in that kind of a thing, to do with trauma, if that's what we're talking about here. But it's just my opinion, and again, not an expert. You were going to say something else?
Yeah, I was actually reading about a study not long ago. I might be able to get that up, so maybe that can be linked in the description. But yeah, I was reading a study about memory, and it was fascinating. So there were participants who it was confirmed with their family. So the researchers confirmed with the participants' family that they had never been in a hot air balloon before. They had no experience of that as a child or anything. But the experiment was that these participants would be asked by the researcher to explain, can you recall that time when you were in a hot air balloon with your family? And even though they had no actual experience of that, more than half actually vividly, gave vivid details of very specific things about this hot air balloon ride that they were never in, just because they were asked to do it. The rest of the participants, even though they initially said that they didn't remember, a week later, most of them came back and said, that, after a while of thinking about it, so like a week went by and they were like, it came back to me. I do remember. And they start giving these vivid explanations of this hot air balloon ride that they were never on. So it just goes to show that just someone asking you a leading question, just explain it, and talking about it as if it's true is enough to get your imagination going. And drawing upon things that you may have seen from other people in hot air balloon rides, or just whatever you know about hot air balloons, your brain then starts going to all of these associations. It's got this network of what's associated with hot air balloons. Well, what do people do? Well, how would they act? And it might merge some of your other memories that are true. So experiences you have of laughing and having a good time with what you know about hot air balloons, and all of a sudden you have this vivid memory that never happened. So just worth mentioning that
I think
have been happening for Jared.
Yeah, distinct possibility for anyone in that kind of a situation. I think as well, like you're talking about this study. I remember in the memory illusion, there's a study similar to that where they have people and they try to get them to think of to recall something that didn't happen, and I think they come back for a few different sessions or something. They do it over multiple sessions, and by the last session, the person who has never had this experience before is embellishing the story, is like adding to it and like talking about things that just didn't happen as if they did. So it's one of these fascinating things, and if any of that sounds sort of weird and sketchy to you or doesn't sort of stack up, I encourage you to look into the sources. As Jess said, that you'll send me that study, right? So I can put that in the description if you can find that. Put that in the description. I'll also link those 2 books as well. So if you think not so sure on that, there's a few sources for you to have a little look at and to get some more information on that. And you can make your own mind up based on what's there. So coming back round to manipulation and the possibility of this being what happened to Jared in this situation, he mentioned there being instances where he was on the phone and there being speakerphone. It being on speakerphone, and Teal and as he told it, Teal and the group essentially listening around and sitting around listening, and Teal using what was being said in the conversation to support what sounded like a narrative that she was already pushing with him in terms of the people around him. And Henny also mentioned as well about like how she would and I'm paraphrasing here, but he mentioned about the idea of him disconnecting with his family a little bit, and that she would encourage that they weren't good for him or something along those lines. And that obviously stood out to me as a more obvious form of not so good. Some of the stuff we've talked about here is a little bit more underhanded, perhaps, whereas that to me would stand out to just about anyone, especially as the way that Jared told it there as well. It should stand out. I think most of us would go, hang on, that's not right with that.
I think as well with his Mormon background, he had been on a mission. So I don't know how much viewers or even yourself know about going on missions, but there's minimal contact with family. Like you basically leave your life behind, and there's no social media. You're basically cut off from anything that isn't to do with your mission. So if you have a loved one, you don't have any contact with them. It's very. I have some concerns about that. That's a whole other topic. The whole things to do with Mormonism, but also on the note of privacy. So my point with that is that that wouldn't have been unfamiliar to him. It's something his red flag may not have gone up at the time for that because he had been used to not being around people he's cared about. But on the topic of privacy, I think that's a big one. I don't know if that's in the bite model. I think it would be. But I think, does Lifton talk about privacy as well?
I'm blanking on it, but I know that there's something about cult of confession and the expectation to share with the group. But, limiting, really a lot of things with cults is about cutting people off, isn't it? Separating people from the world so the other influences aren't affecting the way they're seeing things. And Lifton talks about when you're constantly immersed in a situation, what happens is the feedback loop between experience and interpretation of experience is shrunk down. So you're not able to think for yourself. You're just taking on what's happening in the environment. And through a lack of an opportunity, really, in most cases, I would say, to really think about what's happening and to reflect on it, to develop your own thoughts, opinions, feelings, beliefs, whatever, the situation overrides what you might have thought, might have felt, could have come to, and that becomes what you accept, which is how cult identities as well have a open door there, I think. And that really fits into that, I think, like reducing, like, for example, you can imagine in a high control situation where someone's on the phone and they're privately on the phone to someone, maybe they're listening in or whatever, the others are listening in, but they're privately having a conversation. That is uncontrolled influence from the outside. That is someone saying something that is not going through a filter immediately as it's being heard, which is dangerous to a high control group's control. So it threatens that. So by putting it on speakerphone, by having other people around, what that means obviously is that as soon as the thing's being said, it's going through a filter, even if what is said about it, for example, what Jared mentioned here in this instance of, and I think he was just sort of giving a sort of approximate example of the kind of thing that happened, but like when he'd be on the phone to family or whatever after the fact, Teal would say something along the lines of, "Oh, see, he is evil," or whatever, which is obviously, as I say, an approximation based on similar things that he said happened to him. But yeah, I think going through that filter, if they're having them there, that you almost have, if you're and I imagine trauma bonding fits into this as well, but if you're around people who you have that expectation from to behave a certain way, to think a certain way when you're around them, it's harder to have that internal clarity, that internal almost allegiance to yourself in a way, like I'm looking for a word and I'm not finding it, but like that kind of loyalty to yourself in that moment that you might have when you're in a room talking to someone away from everybody else. When you're having a conversation, you're able to think things through in your own way, but as soon as you're around others, even if you're the one having the conversation and they're just listening, it's going through a filter of what's this person going to think if I say this, especially in a high control situation, if that's what this situation is. So that troubled me.
It's like their own inner voice becomes like silenced, basically. It's shut down. They can't hear their own self-talk because it's just drowned out by the constant interference of the people around them. And that's a problem with a lot of cults, but definitely is part of being in an abusive relationship as well, because often there's like flooding of information, or I could say like information, because it's not always accurate information. It's just whatever the cult leader or abusive person wants you to believe. So when there's enough of that, it's just like you're flooded in it. It's easy to lose sight of your self-talk, which is important for asking questions and getting out of these situations.
And for anyone who's following along on the BITE model, I think that comes under withholding and distorting information, which is a BITE model point, I believe. Going from memory there, so maybe it's worded slightly differently, but withholding and distorting information is somewhere around. I think that also fits into cult identity a little bit, because the cult identity really is a cult appropriate self, as far as I understand it. It's this version of you that is created and conditioned to be to survive in this new situation, whether it's a cult in the way that we normally think of it, or perhaps in a more unorthodox way of thinking it through abusive relationships, which I would say also do fit the BITE model. And as I say, I think Hassan has said that too. How you develop a version of yourself that you are most, if not all of the time, in that situation, that enables you to get by in that situation, so that you are approved of by the leader. And if you do things that don't fit that, the leader will pull you up on it in one way or another, and they'll get you to change, get you to conform in some way. so that you do fit into that. And that's also true of abusive relationships, from what I know, and from what I've heard from other people who've been through those kinds of situations as well. It is that, yeah, it's another you, and you get out. And speaking from experience here on the Teal situation, but you get out and you realize that there's this you that's been there all along that you just kind of disconnected or disconnected from. And then as you start to reconnect with yourself as you go forward, you find actually, no, there is this other me, and this version of me that was created isn't really me. Maybe there's parts of it that I added in there, but there's two yous almost, which I think using the term splitting, which I think is a different in a different context, but Lifton talked about it with reference to, and this is me saying goodbye to any possible monetization on this video, if it wasn't already gone in talking about suicide. Nazi doctors, which Lifton had studied and talked about how there would be these Nazi doctors who would commit these atrocities, just these awful things, and then they would go home to their family and smile and laugh and be this other person, this person they were before having done it all. And it's like they split it in their mind. They separate these two people because they have to be a certain person to survive in these situations where they're doing these atrocious things, so they can be okay with themselves, so they can do it. But then there's also this other situation. There's a few more points here which are all quite concerning points. If you're with us and you're enjoying this video so far, or at least if you're getting something from it, please don't forget to hit the like button before you leave. But we are by no means done yet. We've got a fair amount to still get through on this. So one of the points here is, in what Jared was saying, it sounds like Teal was perhaps using sex to manipulate, based on what he was saying, right? And this is a point that we've got here, which especially ties into his Mormon background. And I know that you can obviously speak a bit about that from your personal experience. So I'll let you just go ahead and start that. Start that point.
There's a lot of restriction when it comes to Mormonism, the same as many other religions, but from what I know of Mormons, and this is in no way trying to put them down, because honestly, as like a surface level thing, whenever I've spoken to Mormon people, they're some of the friendliest, kindest people that I've met. But there is very much this sense of purity that is embedded in them, to the point where it's like you're denying your own human nature. It's in the name of choosing a path of righteousness. So with that, Jared, definitely, you could see at the beginning of the interview, he's talking about the shame that he had just for going through what any teenage boy or girl, anyone, any teenager would go through. Just being made to feel like he was sinning, like there was something wrong with that. I think that definitely made it so that when he comes across Teal and he's feeling suicidal, and in the first time that they meet, Jared describes that already she was using her sexuality, and said to him after, how did you not get, I'm paraphrasing here, but how did you not see that that was sexual, like that was supposed to be like that I wanted you. Now that's someone who was going to see her for healing. That's someone who was going to see her because he was feeling like he didn't want to live anymore.
Right.
And I don't know if she was aware of his Mormon background or not, but if she was, I think the issue of repressed sexuality would be common enough that she would have known that's something that she could exploit. And that's just obviously me speculating, but it's also based on what I've seen, what I've experienced, and what Jared said. I think it's pretty evident that, as we talked about earlier, if it's true that she gave him all of these blissful memories and that alternated with the negative, like, punishments, that sex could have been used as a way to liberate him, to make him feel particularly good, because that had been something that was taken from him earlier on in life. And it's, people often feel that they have to compensate for what they've lost. So I know people who have been in the Mormon church who so that they missed out on their whole life. They missed out on their childhood. I'm not wanting to single anyone out, but even family, people in my family who it just consumed them so much that they felt they missed out. So they're just trying to make up for what they lost. That's definitely something that can be exploited.
I remember something that Jared said in the video where he's talking about how he was trying to contact Teal and trying to book a session with her because she was doing some sort of healing at the time, and they were kind of like, oh, she's busy, until he mentioned that he was suicidal, I believe. And this, according to what Jared was saying, of course, he's saying that. And he was sort of rushed in then. It to me, as someone who has seen what I feel is quite a flippant approach towards suicide, towards death in general, and an overconfidence that concerns me as someone who has dealt with mental health issues in their life and who knows many people who also have. And when she said things like she said in her Stance on Suicide video, where she's talking about how she's uniquely qualified to talk about suicidality, she believes, because she has personal experience and extrasensory abilities, which I would add, I'm not convinced she has. I'm actually not convinced anyone has at this point. I would need to see some more substantial evidence on that. However, I do leave it to anyone else to make up their own mind. Not here to shit on anyone's beliefs. Just a point I'd like to make. And I feel like, seeing also the BBC piece that was done where she was asked what she thinks about people thinking that she had something to do with suicides, if I'm remembering that right. And her response was to say that she thinks it's funny and to laugh. I mean, that struck me as it somewhat odd almost. And yeah, so it bothered me, that did it. So I think that I just want to make that point here and bring that up, that him even ending up in that situation where when he first was in close quarters with her, sex was very much a component, and he was in a position of needing help, needing her help that she was apparently saying she could provide. Sex was entered into the equation. Sex entered into the equation pretty quickly, and that just, for me, that's just not, doesn't strike me as good. Or
well, it's
in my
it's
mind,
unethical. Exactly. It's incredibly unethical. And like I said, I've worked as a counselor before. I would never have, like, if you do something like that, there would be like a lot of legal repercussions that would come along for good reason, because it's just, I think most people can agree that it's just wrong to exploit someone like that. There is a power imbalance, and I think it's also quite telling that she met him through being like a client, and that led into a romantic relationship. So it already started with a power imbalance. It just goes to show, I think anyway, that from the beginning it was like that.
So one of the last things to talk about really is that she, according to Jared in this, Teal lies and has lied a lot, which if you've heard her story, her history of apparent history to do with abuse and those kinds of things, there's one story in there that sticks out as a potential lie, in that she was apparently sewn inside the torso of a corpse at, I think, the age of 9 or something like that, which I believe someone who knows more about that than me has said it is not possible. And so those kinds of things do stand out as lies. And really my only point on Jared saying that she apparently does lie is that he said it. And I think that just, it's something to consider if you're someone who is looking at what Teal's saying and you're thinking, right, there's some stuff here that I would just have to take her word for, given that there are people on record saying that they believe she has lied. That should cast some doubt there, and if nothing else, make it more necessary to double check the information that she's sharing. If you hear her talking about some psychological concept, for example, and I'm sorry, there's a cat in the litter box right now. I'm just going to keep talking, and I hope that's not too loud. If she's talking about some psychological concept, for example, and it sounds cohesive, it seems to make sense and seems to fit conveniently into a worldview that she's talking and sharing about throughout other videos, a good idea perhaps would be to look for other sources on that same issue, see what other people have to say. I know some people do that with her videos anyway, but I would imagine that there are a number of people who don't. I know I didn't, and I imagine there are other people now that are just taking her word for things. And perhaps that's not such a wise idea, given that there are people that do feel strongly that she has lied in the past. Is there anything that you'd like to add to that?
She talks a lot about authenticity, and that's a huge part of her teachings. I just feel it's very inconsistent, and I hope that if people find some truth or had doubts about Teal before, and hearing Jared's story has in some way been believable to them, I hope it just sinks in a little bit that there is a lot of inconsistency where Teal seems to be able to do things that she teaches against, but if others do them, there's a very strong negative reaction to it.
Right. Yeah. And I think as well, I remember talking to Yona about this a little bit, who was a former admin of the old Facebook group now, the Teal Tribe Facebook group, talking about congruence, I think, between the things that Teal says and the things that Teal does. I think that's worth a look. You know, neither Jess or I are sitting here saying that she is or isn't doing anything necessarily, but it definitely begs a closer inspection, I would say, of those kinds of things.
And on the topic of congruence as well, what Teal says is also related to diet. So she's got a video on veganism and just energetically good and bad foods, basically, that you should or shouldn't have. And she teaches that. And also Jared made it clear in his interview that he was like a raw foodist and vegan in his time of being with Teal. So clearly that's something that influenced him, that she influenced him with. But if you look at an interview with her ex, what was it, LA? Is that his name?
LA, yeah, I think that's how it's pronounced. LA, whatever.
I'm not sure. So please forgive me, people. I remember quite distinctly her being asked about her diet, which she said was a vegan diet, but then he added that she does enjoy some good cheese, which of course is not vegan. So you do see some inconsistency, whereas Jared seems to have really strictly, and like that could be to do with his personality. I don't know. Like there's no evidence that she was really strict on him to do with that. I have reason to believe that she would have been, but I just think there's quite a difference there between what she teaches and what she does.
At least, I mean, I remember seeing that video of Ale as well. The interview with Teal and Ale, I think, is we're thinking of the same one. And yeah, based on what you're saying and that, based on what Jared's saying, based on what Yona experienced as well, you know, it does seem to be that there is some real incongruence there in that. And so there was also mention of there being the potential for Teal and Jared to have a child together. That was what Jared mentioned in the interview there.
Now, this one, I want to make it really clear that I don't know the intentions of Teal. I am not claiming to know why she wanted a child. There's every chance that she just really wanted that, and she loved Jared, and that was something that she thought would bring them closer together. But on the topic of manipulation, I want to point out that it's not impossible for it to be something like for a child to be brought into the world for the sake of keeping the bond between Jared and Teal together. Like I've personally had in my past relationship, I was specifically told by my partner that he wanted to have a child with me, so that way even if something goes wrong with our relationship, he'll always have an excuse to contact me. We've seen from Teal that she doesn't really have as much involvement with her child as is his name? It's Winter, right?
Winter, I believe.
Yeah, she doesn't have as much involvement with him as I guess what is like stereotypical of a parent to have.
And that was Cameron talked about that, didn't she? A little bit in her Cameron Clark, in her story,
so
in her.
Everyone else is kind of looking after Winter. They're all his parent, which I mean that can be. Yeah. I'm not frowning upon that because there are certain cultures where that's pretty common, actually.
Of course, yeah.
But I just feel that there is a chance, and I wouldn't overlook that as a potential way to keep someone close and keep that person in your life and be able to manipulate them, especially if she thinks that she's going to have other people doing the hard work and looking after the child.
Cameron's account as well, which you mentioned when we talked about your story here, and you mentioned also your story here. Again, if anyone does want to hear more about your story, that we talked about it here on the channel as well. So as I said earlier, there will be a link to that in the description. But we also mentioned when we talked before on here about Cameron Clark, I believe, and Cameron's story, who Jared actually also mentioned, I believe, although he wasn't able to recall her name. The name he did say, I believe he was talking about Cameron. And so I will link that video, that series of videos. I think it's 5 hours of videos of Cameron telling her story and her experience, which was years and years ago now. And of course, the final thing, really, you already mentioned a little bit diet here. That's a bite model point as well, the controlling of an individual's diet, and having a high fruit or high sugar content in a diet. And obviously when it comes to like raw veganism, I don't know if that's what was happening here, but when it comes to raw veganism, when it comes to having high sugar content, it can affect you in such a way that it can make it harder for you to think critically, to think clearly. If what you're doing is eating a lot of very high sugar things and not much of anything else, not sitting here poo-pooing any particular diets, but that's something that's definitely worth a mention.
I have personally had experience with that same thing. Jared does mention it being a raw vegan diet at some point.
Right.
So I've this is a whole other thing that maybe I'll have to get into another time, but I did have a therapist in my life who was practicing undue influence on me as well. And with his influence, he encouraged me to be a fruitarian. And so I was already vegan, and I still am. So I don't want anyone thinking that, like, if you're vegan and you're watching this, that I'm trying to, like, either Andy or myself are saying that if you're a vegan or vegetarian, you're in a cult, because that's a common misconception as well.
Of course.
It can be used, though. It can be used for, like, to unduly influence people. It's all about the intent, and that's how it was used with me. The whole raw food thing, fruitarian, it was about purity, about being cleansed. It was about somehow that would get me to a higher vibration, and that these other foods were like low vibrational foods, and if you cook it, it's all of these myths that surround food that was encouraged in me. And I believe that was a way for this man, whose name I won't mention, but the therapist that I had, to manipulate me further, because I have some evidence that there was something like that happening. Like I said, it's not really about that. It's about how I think that was potentially happening for Jared as well.
And of course, we've seen since Teal's done videos about a spiritual diet, it is encouraging people to eat specific things for a spiritual reason that can't necessarily be verified, other than perhaps the benefits a person might feel as a result of the placebo effect when eating a specific diet, spiritually speaking. So that about wraps up episode 1. We are planning to do a follow-up episode, at least one follow-up episode to this, perhaps even a third, because there's just so much to cover, and we'll be speaking about things from a different point of view for each one. At this point, the intention for the next episode is to talk about what's left of Teal's ideology, Teal's approach, in Jared's thinking that we can see, or believe we can see, perhaps, in the video that was put out by the Mormon Stories podcast. That will be the next episode that we're planning on this. So if you want to see that, please subscribe to the channel so you get notified. Hit the little bell thing so you'll get notified whenever that does happen. Also, I've talked to Jess about potentially popping onto my Patreon-only podcast, where we just talk about things from a more personal point of view, not necessarily related to this, but cults in general, skepticism and critical thinking and so on in general. If you're interested in that, then you can check that out with the link in the description. But before we go, I just want to say a massive thank you to you, Jess, for joining me here. And if anyone wants to follow you on the internet, find out what you're up to, you've got a YouTube channel, right? Do you want to tell people a little bit about that?
Yeah, I've got a YouTube channel, and the link will be in the description. But it's pretty much, I go into similar things as that Andy does, but I touch on a lot of psychology as well. I haven't been posting as much lately, but I'm planning to come out with more videos debunking the New Age and law of attraction, things like that.
Yeah, so as you say, there's going to be a link for that in the description. And I hope this has been useful for any former Tealers watching this to help you sort of figure things out and make sense of life after the New Age. It's what I'm always trying to do really here on the channel. Thank you everybody for watching, and I guess I'll do my normal sign off. Please be kind and I'll see you in the next one.